you everyone for coming to today's lecture, and thank you Branislav for accepting the invitation to be our guest today. So for today's session, we have Branislav Jakovljević with us, who is a professor at the Department of Theater and Performance Studies at Stanford University. He is the author of many interesting studies, starting from his first book on Daniel Harms, called Daniel Harms Writing at the Event from 2009, all over to his book from 2016, called Alienation Effects, Performance and Self-Management in Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1991. The book that was the winner of the Joe Calloway Prize for the best book on drama theater in 2016 and 17. And he also, the book was co-recipient of Association for Theater in Higher Education Outstanding Book Award in 2017. His most recent book project is The Performance Apparatus on Ideological Production of Behaviors, that will be forthcoming at the University of Michigan Press. Branislav Jakovljević is also one of the culprits, to say so, of promoting the work of a Yugoslav/Serbian philosopher Radomir Konstantinović, whose book Philosophy of Province he co-edited in translation. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago.
2021.
2021. So 3 years ago, the book came out also with University of Michigan Press. And there's been a lot of events and lectures devoted to that event. Beside Branislav Jakovljević is also, I should mention that, contributor to with his authorial text to this website Peščanik. He writes both in English and in Serbian or Serbo-Croatian, and he's very present in the circles of, especially in North America, in the circles of what we now call the New Yugoslav Studies, the new association that has been launched a year ago. So today, thank you, Branislav, again for being with us. And today we will hear his lecture called Europe Number 2, or How to Tautologize with a Hammer, which is devoted to a conceptual writer / artist, Vojislav Despotov. So Branislav, please, floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Sasha. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Sanja. And thank you all for being here. It is really my pleasure and a privilege to talk to you and to present my work. Sasha, thank you for that great introduction. So just briefly, this is a work in progress. I have been working on this material for a while, and then I'm picking it up again. So it will be nice. I will present in maybe 20-25 minutes, and then we'll just continue with the conversation. So I really look forward to your questions and comments. Another quick note, this really comes from my work on alienation effects. Those of you who are interested in the subject of Yugoslav, as it used to be called trans avant-garde, or the second avant-garde, or really experimental visual poetry performance film from the late 50s to 1999, you know that it was extremely prolific and rich. So, of course, not all of that could go into, fit into one book. So it is an ongoing project. So here I'm looking specifically at the late work of Vojislav Despotov, and that's part of the larger project that we could address later, and that's the project of former conceptual artists from the 70s and 80s turning in the 2000s to the form of the novel, which is very, very unusual. So with that being said, I'll just start, and I will start with a Cold War joke that some of you might remember and some of you are too young to remember, but here it is. In a great spying game between the two superpowers, somewhere in the vast plains of Siberia, the Soviets built a detailed replica of a small American town. All of the staple landmarks and amenities were there, from white fences and a church steeple to local movie theater and football field to a popcorn movie theater and everything else. Everyone spoke American English. The kids went to school using American curricula, watched American movies, listened to American music, and all of that. The Soviets spent over 30 years grooming a perfect spy who would be no different from any average American. And he was apprehended the moment he stepped out of the plane at JFK. What gave him up? Any guesses? So he was, spoke nothing but American English, totally on board, and they spotted him the moment he got off the plane. Back in the day, we knew what could give him up. His jeans was ironed, and they knew it right off the bat that he was a Soviet guy. Now we have more really elaborate kind of spying games. If you watch the movie, the TV show, HBO TV show, The Americans, but this is really from the Cold War. And Despotov's novel works, in his novel, Despotov work with this kind of deception, copying, doubling, and all of that. His novels, The Autumn of Every Tree and Europe #2, the first one was published in 1997, the second one in 1998. So these two novels by the Serbian poet, novelist, translator, and conceptual artist Vojislav Despotov are permeated by this sense of duplication and simulation. The first one, The Autumn of Every Tree, chronicles the last days of the socialist bloc in Central and Eastern Europe. In this sprawling chronicle, all roads lead to the Congress of New Hope, held in the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, Poland on December 27, 1989. The Congress, which is an odd, really, event, features a lineup of poets, artists, and inventors who present their artistic projects, obsessive fixations, and outlandish utopias. I will mention, for example, the Romanian poet Mircea Dinescu, who is on a clandestine mission of giving facelifts to weeping willows. So he would sneak out of his apartment armed with pieces of string and scissors in search of these sad trees across Bucharest, which was still reeling from and recovering from recent uprising against the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu. Once he finds the appropriate tree, he proceeds to lift its drooping branches by tying them to the ones above. And in this way, he perks up these melancholy trees. So Despotov paints the picture of really a number of strange fellows, oddballs, inventors, conceptual artists, but still among this motley crew, one figure and one report stands out. The most shocking disclosure comes from the Russian poet Venedikt Zverev, who presents a dazzling revelation to the stunned audience in, as Despotov writes, vast expanses of Siberia, somewhere between Vladivostok and Kursk, on the territory which equals the surface of the entire Europe, there is an artificial realm, an artificial continent, and other Europe under an entirely non-secretive name of New Europe, end quote. Zverev goes on to detail the Soviet government's gargantuan project of making an exact copy of Europe. Quote, the entire continent, including Paris, Rome, and Berlin, they built copies of all cities and rivers. In modified Siberian lakes, there were Sicily, Iceland, Corsica, Majorca, Great Britain, and even that tiny Danish island with Hamlet's tower on it, end quote. The details of this copy are astonishing. In Danish sector, there are thoroughbred cows. In German, there are excellent wursts and beer, and everything is exactly the same as in the original Europe, end quote. The Russian poet reveals that building the new Europe was the true reason for establishing labor colonies across Siberia. Few inmates stayed, survived in the camps, and even fewer knew what the purpose of their toil was. According to Zverev, the Soviet copy of Europe surpassed the original. Since the new Europe remains uninhabited, there is no danger that vandals and careless inhabitants and tourists would damage and spoil these carefully built structures. As detailed as Zverev is in his description of the new Europe, he can't offer a convincing justification for this colossal undertaking. While being adamant that the copycat Europe was not built for military or ideological reasons, he ends his presentation by inviting his audience to ponder the reasons that drove Soviet leaders to build a replica of an entire continent in the Siberian wasteland. While Zverev's astonishing expose about the new Europe was but one segment, 20 pages of a much larger novel, The Autumn of Every Tree, his next novel, Europe Number 2, which Europe Number 2 was dedicated in its entirety to the vertiginous idea of building a duplicate of Europe in Siberia. If in the first novel, Despotov chronicled the final months of 1989 as an end time of historical and personal epochs, in the second book, this focus on the temporal dimension of the sea change in the history of the 20th century gives way to spatial considerations. This shift is suggested already in the titles of the two novels. Whereas the first one features prominently the season of the year that is usually associated with transformation in nature, the fall. And here I have to say and remind you that Despotov was a translator from English into Serbian, and that he also ran a private literary journal. I mean, he owned it, he published it. It was called Hey Joe, and it was dedicated to American literature. And I don't think it's at all accidental that he named his novel Jesem svakog drveta, the fall. You know, we can translate it either by the autumn of every tree or the fall of every tree. I think he aimed at fall. You know, there is a really significant wordplay with the fall of Eastern Europe, the fall, the decay of the Soviet Empire and all of that. So the fall of every tree is significant, really, very symbolic title. So in the fateful year of 1989, that really the narrative really talks about the massive political and social change. And in the second novel, we don't have that emphasis on time, on the moment of the historical period. Instead, it foregrounds the spatial reproduction, Europe Number 2. So it's no longer New Europe, it's Europe Number 2. Retaining the concept he presented in Zverev's disclosure, Despotov abandons the phrase New Europe in favor of Europe Number 2. This change may appear as a pure formality. I suggest it is significant at least for two reasons. First, Europe number 2 can be seen as a reference to the Cold War and post-colonial stratification of the globe into three zones: the industrialized first, the socialist second, and the developing third world. If, from the moment of the emergence of this geopolitical map of the globe, the Second World disturbed a clear division between North and South, the colonizer and colonized, the industrial and the undeveloped, and rich and poor regions of the world, that was because it was not a clear opposite of the First World, but its other. This otherness is the second point of significance of the title Europe number 2. Both of the Despotov novels I discuss here are travelogues of sorts. In the first one, The Fall of Every Tree, the artist and inventor and Despotov's names of his characters in these novels are totally outlandish. So in the first novel, The Fall of Every Tree, the protagonist's name is Valsiyov Devotops, and he travels from Novi Sad to Warsaw. And in the second, the installation and performance artist, whose name is Victim with a K, escapes a small Balkan country engulfed in a war, but instead of emigrating to the West, as many of his countrymen did, he journeys eastward, ending up beyond the Ural Mountains. What he finds there is not exactly the new Europe from The Fall of Every Tree. This time, the replica is not the same as the original. Instead, the traveler stumbles into a flimsy reproduction of Europe number 1. Having crossed a wide Siberian river, he enters the landscape that resembles the Netherlands. Only, unlike in the real lowlands, here the windmills are not functioning and three-dimensional, but made of two-dimensional panels. There are highways in Europe number 2, but they are not made of tarmac. These surfaces only have the color of asphalt, but are paved with mud and dirt, leveled and compacted with steam rollers and trucks. The traveler encounters similar shoddiness in New Berlin, which comes together with the wall, in New Rome, in New Warsaw, in New Nice, and in New Belgrade and other metropoles of this new old continent. The second Europe is not an exact replica of the first one, but a mock-up and a coulisse. In another modification of the concept of the new Europe presented in the autumn of every tree, in Europe number 2, Despotov presents the construction of a simulacrum of Europe as a vast project that exceeds the historical confines of Stalin's Gulag and expands back to the very beginnings of the Siberian labor colonies in Tsarist Russia. In fact, this effort to build a copy of Europe in newly conquered expanses of the East is one of very few things that brings together Tsarist and Soviet empires. The protagonist of Despotov's novel presents the research of one V.Z. Kruganov, who calculated that, quote, only from 1917 to 1957, some 55 million people labored in and around the camps, end quote. One should add millions that came before and after them during the Tsarist period and after 1957, from the conquest of Siberia until the demise of Soviet Union. Still, all of that prison labor leaves these expanses unpopulated. While in the autumn of every tree, the narrative about replica of Europe ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall, in Europe number 2, it expands into post-Soviet times. And that's the most interesting part for me. Here, the second Europe is not a simple recreation of the original, but an active simulation. Still vacant and unpopulated, this sprawling built environment that have been erected across Siberia is not just left to sit there, slowly decaying. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the closure of penal colonies, the authorities of the Russian Federation have turned over the cities, roads, and factories of Europe #2 to artists to stage their performances. From a vast labor camp, these structures have been transformed into a huge-scale performance art retreat. Gulag archipelago has become an archipelago of the arts, and the second Europe, the state of the arts. Victim, the traveler, and his co-travelers perform in second Berlin in front of the second wall. The second Europe features not only the second Sicily, the second Pyrenees, and the whole system of second fjords, but also the second Cabaret Voltaire, the second Fex, the second Victory of the Sun, Victory over the Sun, and other really milestones of the first avant-garde. In short, and quite ironically, the second Europe is the home of the second avant-garde. After the publication of The Autumn of Every Tree, in Europe #2, Despotov decided not only to expand one of its segments, but he also changed his mind about the nature of this continent-sized construction project. The most significant change concerns the execution of the replica of Europe as at its vast periphery. Whereas in the first novel it seems to improve on the original, in the second it emerges as its poor copy. While Despotov never offered a direct explanation of this choice, his inclusion of performance art in Europe #2 offers an important clue. By having the second avant-garde as an integral part of the Siberian Europe, Despotov, who was himself an important practitioner and theoretician of conceptual and performance art in Yugoslavia, inscribes himself into the narrative itself. The novel concludes with the protagonist's grand performance called Hammer of Tautology, in which, using only a hammer, he creates a replica of Belgrade within the second Belgrade. It is a copy of a copy, each one poorer and shoddier than the other. Despotov names this performance after his major theoretical work from the 1980s, subtitled A Survey. The study was, the theoretical work was called The Hammer of Tautology, A Survey of the New Forms of Technical Intelligence in the Poetry of Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. And it was one of the most in-depth examinations of concrete and visual poetry in socialist Yugoslavia, on the scene in which Despotov was very active as a concrete and visual poet. The invocation of his own work in the conclusion of Europe #2 is not just a gesture of vain self-referentiality. In itself, it is a comment on one of the key theoretical pronouncements on the nature of conceptual art. In his influential article, Conceptual Art 1962-1969, From the Aesthetics of Administration to the Critique of Institutions, the art historian Benjamin Buklo argued that the destiny of conceptual art was to aspire to the condition of tautology. If Buklo took tautology as a figure of simple repetition, exemplified in the figure of the equilateral square, Despotov seems to suggest that the nature of repetition is never simple and often violent. As suggested in the performance of tautologizing with a hammer, repetition is not a simple gesture of bringing back the same, but the movement of gradual reduction. This insight pertains not only to art, but to history. In Despotov's novel, one of the facilitators in charge of Europe #2 as a vast performance art retreat, explains the logic behind the strange affiliation of the enormous Siberian stage with performance art. Not theater, mind you, performance art. Quote, "The entire history of the world flows into that form of artistic expression called performance. The humanity ended one of its epochs, and now it is belching it out through a nuclear art form which contains all genres and subgenres: poetry, painting, gesture, ballet, politics. The true significance of performance art is contained in the fact that it recapitulates the history and art itself." End quote. So we can say that where history ends, performance begins, or to put it differently, performance begins at the end of history. The facilitator explains further, quote, "We brought to New Europe the buds of modern art, especially its substratum called performance, because they are buds of the end of the world." End quote. The true and devastating meaning of this statement becomes apparent only now, a quarter century after Despotov's fantasy about the Second Europe first appeared in print. Despotov's vision of Europe #2 is unique among literary attempts to comprehend and understand Siberia as a penal colony that stretches far and wide in both time and space. What it suggests is that the vast contiguous empire, first Tsarist and then Soviet, responded to the challenges that were coming from the West through an enormous internalization of violence. Imperial expansion is always internal as much as it external, and it demands an ideological colonization of the metropole in the same way it engages in spatial conquest of foreign territories. The Second Europe is an outward and visible expression of that internal colonization. As such, it acquires a unique form in the politics of Putin's new Russia that emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Union. The vision of Europe that has been coming from Kremlin since the beginning of the new millennium, and especially over the past couple of years since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, is precisely that phantasmatic image of a contrived, duplicate, dilapidated, and worn-out world that we find in Europe #2, all the way and including the readiness to enact its end in nuclear disaster. Okay, I'll end here.
Thank you, Branislav. This is really inspiring. There is a lot to unpack. I guess for many of us, work of Vojislav Despotov is less known, or for some probably unknown. I will, if necessary, ask some questions just to contextualize this writer before we open up the floor to a further discussion. So Vojislav Despotov was born in 1950s and died in 2000. He lived a relatively short life, right? 50 years. He was a member of Vojvodina avant-garde coming from Zrenjanin, together with other artists such as Vojica Todosijević, one of the maybe closest to him, Jovica Acin as well. As young, he started, as you said, with poetry. They very quickly started to do their own journals in Novi Sad. He was a very prominent author as a voice of concrete and visual poetry, as you said himself. He was translating, as you said, not only from English, but also from Slovenian. He wrote books for kids two books for children books that are very playful, innovative, and full of imagination. And he could be also talked as the author of children's literature in a way. He was, besides that, involved in conversation with other artists who are also performance artists at the time, such as Tatlin Ladik, for example, from Vojvodina as well. And as you said, late in his career, he turned to prosaic form of the novel, which definitely is surprising. But there is throughout his work this notion of closeness to experimental art forms, conceptual art, and very much he was involved in this sort of prophetic narrative. And from that point of view, I think your connection to the contemporary moment, political moment, is something that I guess resonates with everyone here present, and something that we could talk further about. So I'll just stop here and maybe open up the floor for discussion. And if nobody has something to ask, maybe I can jump in and ask a question, but I'll just like check if anyone wants to comment or ask a question, please do so.
Actually, I would like just to add a little bit, and thank you for that contextualization of Despotov's work. Really a very prolific, very wide-ranging in many forms and genres. And then really this turn towards novel late in his life is a little bit surprising when we look at his avant-garde poetry and conceptual artwork. But then when we take a broader look, it's not that unusual, because a number of former conceptual arts starting in the 1990s in Serbia, I'm not sure, I know they did not do that in Slovenia, for example, or Croatia. They started turning towards novel. So he publishes The Fall of Every Tree in 1997, and in the same year, another extremely significant novel by a former poet and conceptual artist, Judita Šalgo, comes out, her Road to Birobidzhan, which he invokes in the Europe #2. So really, we're looking there at the constellation of novels. These three novels work together. For those of you who don't know, Birobidzhan is this strange Soviet entity, an attempt to create a Jewish autonomous region in the far east of Siberia, in really the region of Siberia which is hard to reach. They started resettling Soviet Jews from Ukraine, from western parts of the Federation, all the way there. And that project never picked up. They ended up settling maybe 10, 15, the numbers are really contradictory. However, the experiment, like many other Soviet experiments with mass population relocation, did not work out. And Judita Šalgo, who was a really significant poet, conceptual artist, and editor, also from Novi Sad, at the end of her life, wrote this amazing novel, The Road to Birobidzhan. The story doesn't end there. Slobodan Tišma, another leading Novi Sad conceptual artist, became in the 2000s a prominent, really novelist, wrote a series of novels, won a prestigious NIN Literary Award. And another thing that really stands out to me is that this turn towards the novel is tied with the wars in Yugoslavia, Serbia's participation in it, and specifically by war crimes. So Slobodan Tišma, one of his later novels, is about really a prolonged reflection on his inability to address the genocide in Srebrenica. We have another significant novel by Sreten Ugričić, who refers to himself as conceptual artist, whose novel To the Unknown Hero is also really dealing with war crimes in Kosovo this time. So that's really a much broader turn. It's not just related to Despotov. It's, I think, a very significant cultural shift that is happening with that generation of artists.
Yeah, thank you for reflecting on that. And I would just add also, because I talked about it, Sreten Ugričić published his book Infinity the same year as Judita Šalgo's and Vojislav Despotov's novel were published. And that is definitely, as you said, or most likely connected to the reality at the time, because the novel was still luckily is the literary form that that is able to kind of swallow up other genre and be maybe the form that is closest to the one that could somehow articulate or grasp the totality or some sort of illusion of totality. And maybe that's the reason that these conceptual are one of the reasons that they turn to novel. Maybe I can ask you a question because you are a very interdisciplinary scholar of not only performance but art, or you are the scholar who are looking at the performance throughout the other art forms. Maybe I can ask you, why do you think that in Vojislav Despotov's case, in both of these novels, The Autumn of the Every Tree and Europe #2, why this form of performance plays such a significant role, except for what you explained, is this syncretic form able to kind of encompass all sorts of other artistic forms?
Yeah, it's a very intriguing question. I have been working on a number of novels who are dealing with by the authors who are moving from one art form to another. I think there are two possible ways of approaching that question. One is within the larger history of avant-garde art. If we look at it, really, the novel was despised by the surrealists. They hated Breton, even though he wrote Naja and Medlov and all of that. They thought the novel is an art form that should be absolutely abolished. And actually, their longer prose pieces were everything but conventional novels. Why? Because novel is a really bourgeois literary form par excellence. In order to read the novel, you have to have a warm place to live in. You have to have all of your other needs taken care of. And in the evening, you sit in your nice bourgeois salon and you read a very long novel by Proust or whatever. And they were extremely radically collective, really, artists geared towards extreme and collective, really, forms of art. So from Dada to surrealists and then to the second avant-garde, this collective, collaborative way of working is really the leading way of producing art. Working on it collaboratively, collectively, and in the way, in a sense, really renouncing the idea of an all-controlling mind who can create the worlds, right? Despotov collaborated with Sreten Ugričić. They collaborated with Novi Sad groups. We always have groups. One thing that comes to mind is that in the 1990s, that kind of collective public work was no longer sufficient and maybe no longer possible. So in order to reflect on everything that is going on, a number of artists are quite improbably looking and turning to the form that was rejected completely. And their attempts to address war crimes and all of that is yet another, really, for me, a really piece of evidence, if you will, that you are, if you are dealing with these issues, really dealing with a very, very solitary situation in this society.
Yeah, thank you for connecting, and that would be in a way your response to why they return to novel. Yeah, which makes sense. Sanya, you have a question, so please go in.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Branislav. Your generation, or more or less, we are very close, so quite familiar with all that you are talking about. But then my question is directed to the this conceptual part, or what makes this art conceptual art, and relative to the question of alienation, in respect for what is happening now. Where is this huge effort in building worlds through concepts, giving body to concepts, and providing a hope which will give us strength to go on in such a destructive times that we are living in. And artists that you were mentioning, more or less, their lives were very short compared to Raša. I mean, everybody, like a flame, they burnt quickly. So coming back to what I wanted to now bring to our fellows as well, this issue of alienation, how an effort to build a conceptual work is at the same time, and it's on you to finish it, how it's hard to keep it grounded, and especially in days of populism, in days of all that we are confronting now.
Thank you so much for that question. So first, really, I want to address this connection between conceptual art and literature, which is only at the first glance unusual. If we look, I don't know if there are art historians in the room or there are people who are interested in art history, but one of the really key features of conceptual art is its turn to language. Conceptual art works with language. We need only think of art and language group from Great Britain and New York. So they are radically renouncing an art, really the art object, and embracing really a discursive replacement of the art object with language, right? And they have been experimenting with language, using language in many different ways. Since I mentioned art and language, they used it really in their theoretical works, and the theoretical work replaces the object. So Levitt would describe the art object and send the description to the gallery, and they can either put it together or not. But also there were some artists, such as Lucy Lippert, who wrote novels, which is really interesting. In 1974, she wrote a novel, and there were others who really, there was even a small branch of conceptual art called narrative art, in which the artists actually used all kind of media to create narratives, from language or discursive way of telling a story to photographs, images, drawings, all kinds of stuff. So there is that connection. And in terms of alienation, I think, you know, I have the misfortune to have written the book Alienation Effect. So, you know, everyone thinks I know everything about alienation. But one thing that was like an alienation expert, you know, one thing that was really significant about the Yugoslav project of self-management was that the entire project was really geared towards addressing the question of alienation of labor. It was the only form of socialism in Eastern Europe, if you will, theoretically, which did not really ground itself in the later works of Marx, Das Kapital and all of that. It was grounded in his early work, and that switch happened in 1948. And in his manuscripts, economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, he's dealing extensively with alienation. That comes up in the German ideology again, and then Marx departs from it. So the Yugoslav project was really focused on that youthful, young Marx, and that form of socialism was very much different from the rest. So it was geared towards de-alienation, how to de-alienate the work. And it is my thesis that really focus on de-alienation created the social space for this kind of art. Conceptual art in Yugoslavia, unlike in the rest of Eastern Europe, and unlike the conceptual art in Western Europe, was done, however small scale it was, however humble it was, in publicly funded galleries and cultural centers. All of that was funded by the state, even though in many of its statements it was directly critical of the state. So if you can get out of alienation, it is through that kind of critique. What we can observe now these days, I'll try to be short, is, you know, when we see the distance between that work and where we are now, how quickly and how radically it has been historicized, that tells us many things. One of the key takeaways to me is the radicality and thoroughness with which societies tend to forget. Societies are always involved in an intense process of forgetting. In the region of the former Yugoslavia, an enormous amount of work has been done on forgetting everything that was accomplished until 1991. So not a word about a different form of labor organization such as self-management. All of that was actively suppressed. And indeed, by going back to this art, we can withdraw some really elements of that vast and important project of de-alienation.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And you provided me the context, because this, you say, intense process of forgetting, it's literally erasing traces and whatever there is in reactualization of any of these forms of living, these new discourses want to catch it as a nostalgic, as a memorial, which is the opposite.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's so interesting to go forward and try to catch up with these elements that are actually possibly something that can bring resilience to the regional aspect. And we have Kriton from Albania, same thing in Albania, or we don't know our own, and I'm not going to say tradition, it's not tradition, but we do not know our own context in 20th century.
Yeah.
Because we ought to erase it. We ought to get rid of it and to slide on neoliberal aspects of even working on memories, working on politics of identity, all this that makes us more aggressive and pending in hostilities. So it's thank you again for what you're doing, because in these it's like having a fragmented knowledge, but keep it alive and decontextualize it, because nowadays it's not only this, as I said, politics of identity that makes us being angry, hysteric, and without even knowing what we have, because Despotov or Judita, I mean, this is what we had. It's not only the things that brought us nationalist.
Absolutely. For many shortcomings of self-management project, one thing that is really, now that the time has passed, thing that stands out is that it was an attempt to create a rational form of collectivity. A rational form of collectivity in which, at least to some degree, the workers have an opportunity to talk to each other horizontally and to make decisions. Now, with really nationalist and neoliberal model, we're plunged into an ecstatic form of collectivity, right? As we speak now, like this very moment, we're in the same time zone. We have an attempt in Belgrade to organize the evening of Albanian and Serbian meeting of poets called Mirdita, which has been banned. I just checked the news before I went on Zoom. Why? Because of the security reasons. All of these nationalists showed up and, threatened violence, and the thing was shut down. So indeed, these are very ecstatic, very effective forms of collectivity, which are really dominating the public discourse. Sorry, let's just see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, if anyone has a comment, a question, please jump in.
Now, it's quite unusual, Branislav, because what you provided is like concrete stuff and right to the bottom of it in terms of content. And it's rare, so it's so nice to have this precise element of it's not historical thing. It's whenever it touches arts, I do not concern it as historical. It's very much livable thing.
It's
happening. Know about it.
there is this idea that everything ended, you know, at some point, and it's done, eradicated, and we live in a completely different world, and that's not the case at all.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Maybe I can jump in and ask you a question, going back to what you said about the main thesis of your book, that Yugoslav system of self-management, in a way, with all these cultural centers throughout, created the conditions within which this experimental art could have emerged and be shared. And I think in my, at least, research of the neo-avant-garde or trans-avant-garde, it shows up that all these people were in some way in the peripheries, right? They were in Celje, in Split, in Novi Sad, in Zrenjanin, not like in the main cities. And that is very, very telling and very interesting. They all collaborated. They published in the journals that were funded by the state, specifically journals that promoted this type of experimental art. And in a way, there was an idea of a text as a social gesture, right? Yeah. As aesthetic that was active. Yeah. So going back to Sanya's question, how can we, methodological question, how can we, or can we at all, look at these artistic forms and try to salvage or to remember the conditions from which they sprang, and maybe try to reactivate them or to recreate them in contemporary moment?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And one thing that really bothers me very much is taking that art out of its social and political context. That's what has been happening with Marina Abramović for 20 years now. And, you know, everyone is sick and tired of it. And her really spinning her own myths about her family and her mother and father who were communists and this and that. I mean, you know, and selling these stories to the audience that is naive and doesn't know better. I think it's really, to me, it was really important to look at this art side by side with a really political economy, or within the context of the political economy of the country, precisely in order not to romanticize it. If we look at these examples from Oho to Red Peristyle in Split to Novi Sad group and Subotica and Zagreb, the group of Six Authors and all of that, they look all like this great, great art, which is quite in step with everything that was going on in Western Europe and the US. However, it is really a part of a much more complex, a really landscape in which not, if we judge Yugoslavia only by that art, we would think, my goodness, that was Sweden. You know, it was much more advanced than it was. That same political economy produced also the very people who destroyed the country. They were all at one point really that they came through the institutions, all of them but one or two. So really, it was a very complex system that was able to produce this really extraordinary art and really destructive political personalities and movements. I'm not sure if I'm... Yes, and also they were at the periphery. Yes, they were at the periphery of institutional art, you know. However, one thing that has been bothering me very much is that this kind of conceptual art, highly advanced and all of that, was produced mainly north of Danube and Sava. From Belgrade to Novi Sad to Zagreb to Ljubljana. Split is one small exception, it's south, right? I'm really interested in what was going on at the same time in Sarajevo, in Pristina, in Skopje, in that part of the country. There was a different kind of modernism going on there. And that's a great project. I hope someone does it at one point.
Yeah. But there are studies about the Podrum group in Sarajevo from the late 80s.
late 80s. Podrum was in Zagreb. Zvono was in Sarajevo.
Zvono.
Yeah, yes, there was that moment in the late 80s, 70s still, you know, socialist aestheticism was the name of the game, south of Danube and Sava. I'm not saying that it's, you know, less valuable than the stuff that was done in these conceptual art centers. I think it's vastly neglected now. We need to look at it more seriously. Anyway, that's an art historical question.
Well, if anyone, again, has a comment or a question, please jump ahead.
It was quite intense. It was quite intense and unusual, I may say. And I'm just looking forward, and I hope really, Branislav, that we can slowly but steadily touch the basis on how to work on this. Next year, I'm planning with Bojana Kunst to work on Yugo-futurism, and I spoke to Aleksandar about it as well with Maska from Ljubljana, and we really need to continue bit by bit. It's very sensitive matter, but at the same time, I'm teaching intermediate to my students, and if I'm talking about Dick Higgins, then I need to talk also about the context, what happened in our countries at the same time. So it's not that avant-garde or the arts happened somewhere else. We were receiving most of these artists. They were coming and working with us in 70s, 80s. So yeah, we should just value these aspects more.
Yeah. It's really important to keep that inquiry going. There is so much. Yeah.
Aleksandar, if this is it, then we can wrap it up because Branislav was also very generous, and he provided us dense but very short.
Yeah. I mean, I hope we will have chance to continue this conversation beyond today's limits. But thank you again, Branislav, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thanks everyone again for joining us. It was a real pleasure, and I am personally looking forward to our next seminar.
Thank you so much, everyone. Great talking to you. Yeah, good luck with the rest of the seminar.
Thank you. Thank you. And cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.